Flint Hills, Kansas, August 1878. While every rancher built on high ground to avoid wet foundations and flooding, Stephen Jones was doing the opposite. He'd spent $100,000 on land that neighbors called a bog, 160 acres of Fox Creek bottomland where springs bubbled up year-round. They called him a fool for building where water gathered instead of where it drained away. Jones wasn't just constructing a $25,000 ranch house with 20 men working day and night. He was digging deeper, carving out a root cellar, then tunneling further to build something they'd never seen, a spring room where cold groundwater flowed through stone troughs. Neighbors laughed at the waste. All that stone, all that digging, all that faith in swamp water when any sensible man knew you built dry and stored food in shade. Then the 1890s brought drought and killing heat across the plains. Homesteads failed, cattle died, and on every ranch, milk turned sour within hours, while butter spoiled faster than families could eat it. But in that fool's underground spring room, containers of milk sat half submerged in 55-degree water that never stopped moving. His dairy never spoiled. His milk never soured. What did Jones understand about groundwater, thermal mass, and food preservation that everyone else dismissed as swamp sense? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Stephen Jones stepped off the train in Cottonwood Falls on August 15, 1878, carrying more capital than most men saw in a lifetime. $100,000 in available funds built from years in the Texas and Colorado cattle business meant he could buy what others only dreamed of owning. While fellow cattlemen arriving in the Flint Hills scrambled for cheap grazing land, Jones had his eye on something different: water security that wouldn't disappear when seasonal creeks dried to dust. The 160 acres of Fox Creek bottomland cost him $2,000, and every neighbor who heard the price shook their heads. Smart ranchers built on ridges and hilltops, where foundations stayed dry and spring floods couldn't reach the buildings. The low ground that Jones had purchased turned into a swampy mess after every hard rain, fine for cattails and red-winged blackbirds, but no place for a sensible man to build anything permanent. Local wisdom said, avoid wet ground at all costs. And here was this Tennessee transplant doing exactly the opposite. But Jones wasn't buying bog. He was buying springs. 3 reliable water sources bubbled up from underground year-round, fed by the same limestone aquifer that kept the Flint Hills green when surrounding prairie turned brown, while his neighbors depended on surface water that could vanish during drought. Jones had secured access to groundwater that held steady near 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what Kansas weather threw at the surface. He understood something that most frontier builders missed. Water wasn't just about having enough to drink. It was about having enough to build systems around. The old-timers who'd been in Kansas since the 1860s tried to educate him. Wet ground meant rot, they explained. Wet ground meant mosquitoes and mud, and foundations that shifted with every freeze-thaw cycle. A man with his kind of money could afford prime ridgeland with good drainage and solid rock for building. Why choose a location that would fight him every step of the way? Jones listened politely and kept his plans to himself. He'd seen enough cattle operations fail from poor water planning to know that consistent access to cold, clean water was worth more than perfect drainage. What Jones envisioned wasn't just a ranch house, but an integrated system where water, food storage, and shelter worked together. The springs weren't obstacles to build around. They were the foundation of everything he planned to construct. Most American farmers before electrification understood this principle, even if Flint Hills ranchers had forgotten it. Spring houses had been built over natural water sources across Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia for more than a century. Small stone buildings, typically 7 feet by 8 feet, up to 20 feet by 30 feet depending on the family's needs, constructed directly over or adjacent to springs to protect the water source and used the constant cool temperature for food preservation. The physics behind springhouse technology was straightforward enough that any frontier builder could grasp it. Underground water maintains a temperature close to the mean annual air temperature of the region, usually somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees in most of the continental United States. That meant spring water emerged from the ground at roughly the same temperature year-round, creating a natural cooling system that required no fuel, no maintenance, and no mechanical parts that could break down. While air temperatures swung from below zero in winter to over 100 degrees in summer, spring water held steady in the mid-50s, providing what amounted to a geological refrigerator. Jones had seen spring house operations during his earlier years in Tennessee and understood their value for dairy work. Milk kept at 55 degrees lasted days longer than milk stored at room temperature. Butter stayed firm instead of melting into unusable liquid. Cheese aged properly instead of spoiling in the heat. The difference between having reliable cold storage and depending on shade and luck could mean the difference between a profitable operation and watching food value drain away with every hot afternoon. But Jones wasn't planning a traditional 7 by 8 foot spring house, tucked away from the main buildings. He was designing something more ambitious, cold storage integrated directly into his living and working spaces. The ranch house itself would become the centerpiece of a water management system that started with the springs, moved through the building for household use, then continued underground to provide cooling for food storage before flowing out to irrigate gardens and fill livestock tanks. Every gallon would do multiple jobs instead of being used once and discarded. His neighbors watched the initial surveying work with growing skepticism. Jones had hired engineers to map not just the house site, but the underground water flow, the elevation changes across the property, and the best routes for gravity-fed water movement. This wasn't the approach of a man throwing up a quick shelter before winter. This was the methodology of someone planning for decades of operation, someone who intended to build once and build right, regardless of what the local experts recommended. The mockery started before the first foundation stones were laid. Coffee shop conversations in Cottonwood Falls centered on the rich fool from Tennessee who was determined to build his mansion in a swamp. Why would a man with that kind of capital ignore basic frontier wisdom about site selection? Why choose the lowest, wettest ground available when he could afford the best ridge sites in the county? The consensus was that Jones had more money than sense, and Kansas weather would teach him the error of his ways soon enough. What the neighbors couldn't see was that Jones was applying lessons learned from years of cattle operations where water management made the difference between profit and bankruptcy. A ranch that depended entirely on surface water was a ranch one drought away from failure. A ranch with reliable spring water and proper storage systems could weather dry years that destroyed less prepared operations. Jones wasn't fighting the landscape. He was hiring its most reliable feature to work for him every day of the year. Construction began in earnest during the spring of 1879, and within weeks the Jones Ranch became the most talked-about building project in the Flint Hills. 20 skilled workers arrived by rail from Kansas City, along with wagon loads of cut limestone quarried from the same geological formation that fed his springs. The scale of the operation drew travelers who mistook the activity for a new town being platted. Men worked in shifts through daylight and lantern light, laying foundation stones that extended far deeper into the earth than any house foundation the locals had ever seen. The ranch house itself was impressive enough to justify the attention. 11 rooms across 4 levels, built with the kind of architectural details that belonged in Topeka or Kansas City rather than the middle of cattle country. The final cost would reach $25,000 by completion in 1881, more than most neighboring ranchers had invested in their entire operations, including livestock and equipment. But the house, grand as it was, wasn't what made the project genuinely unusual. What captured local attention was what Jones was building underneath. The root cellar extended 12 feet underground, carved directly into the hillside behind the main house, and lined with the same limestone blocks used for the foundation. Large enough to store barrels of flour, sacks of grain, preserved vegetables, and all the supplies a family would need to survive months of isolation, the cellar also served as storm shelter during the violent weather that swept across Kansas every spring and summer. The temperature underground held steady near 55 degrees year-round, perfect for long-term food storage without the spoilage problems that plagued surface pantries during hot weather. But the root cellar was only the beginning of Jones's underground construction. Beyond the main storage room. Workers continued digging, carving out a tunnel that led deeper into the hillside toward the primary spring source. This wasn't standard root cellar construction, and the neighbors who stopped by to observe the work couldn't figure out what Jones was planning. The tunnel was wide enough for a man to walk through comfortably, lined with stone blocks and carefully graded to allow water flow without creating standing pools that would turn stagnant and foul. The tunnel led to what Jones called his spring room, though it bore little resemblance to the simple spring houses scattered across rural America. The room measured roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, entirely underground and positioned to take advantage of the natural water flow from the hillside springs. Cold spring water entered the room through carefully positioned stone channels, flowed through a shallow trough system that Jones had designed to circulate around the entire perimeter of the room, then continued through another tunnel to exit into a collecting cistern on the downhill side of the property. The engineering was more sophisticated than anything the local builders had attempted. Jones had positioned his collecting cistern on the hillside above the house to create water pressure for the domestic plumbing system. Spring water flowed by gravity from the source through the spring room, then uphill through a carefully graded channel to fill the elevated cistern. From there, the same water supplied the kitchen, washrooms, and other household needs before flowing down to the spring room for food cooling, then continuing to a second underground cistern that fed irrigation lines for gardens and landscaping. Every gallon of spring water performed multiple functions before finally reaching the creek, and the entire system operated without pumps or mechanical equipment that could break down. Neighbors called the underground construction excessive, but Jones understood that he was building infrastructure that would pay dividends every day of operation. The spring room maintained a constant temperature of 55 degrees, created by the thermal mass of the stone construction and the continuous flow of cold groundwater. Unlike surface buildings that heated up during summer afternoons and cooled down at night, the underground space held steady regardless of what happened above ground. This temperature stability was the key to reliable food preservation in an era before mechanical refrigeration. The trough system within the spring room was designed for maximum cooling efficiency. Spring water filled shallow stone channels that were deep enough to partially submerge milk crocks, butter containers, and cheese wheels while allowing easy access for daily use. The water moved continuously through the troughs, preventing the stagnation that would have created bacterial problems, and the flow rate was controlled by stone dams that could be adjusted to maintain proper depth in each section of the system. Milk containers could be placed directly into the flowing water, butter could be kept firm even during August heat waves, and cream could be held at the proper temperature for churning into high-quality butter. The construction techniques that Jones employed were based on proven springhouse principles but scaled up to ranch-size operations. The stonework was precisely fitted to prevent leaks while allowing controlled water movement. The underground placement provided natural insulation from temperature swings, while the continuous water flow created convection cooling that maintained consistent conditions throughout the room. Ventilation was carefully planned to prevent condensation problems while maintaining the cool air temperature that complemented the water cooling system. Local skeptics focused on the cost and complexity of what they saw as an underground luxury. Traditional root cellars served the same storage purpose for a fraction of the expense, and most frontier families managed dairy preservation through quick consumption and simple cooling methods like wet cloths and shaded areas. Jones was investing thousands of dollars in stonework and excavation to solve a problem that others handled with 50 cents worth of materials and common sense. The elaborate water routing system struck them as the kind of over-engineering that separated practical settlers from wealthy amateurs who had more money than understanding of frontier realities. But Jones had calculated the economics differently. Spoiled milk represented lost food value, wasted labor time, and missed opportunities to convert surplus into butter and cheese that could be sold or traded. A dairy cow producing 3 gallons per day generated over 1,000 gallons annually, and each gallon that spoiled before use represented a direct loss in both nutrition and potential income. The spring room system would prevent spoilage losses that could easily exceed the construction costs within a few years of operation, while providing food security that couldn't be purchased at any price during shortages or supply disruptions. The system was completed in 1881, and Jones invited neighbors to inspect the finished construction. The spring room impressed even the skeptics with its engineering precision and obvious functionality, though most still considered it an expensive solution to problems that simpler methods could address adequately. The 1890s brought weather that tested every assumption about Kansas resilience. The drought that began in 1893 stretched across 2 brutal seasons, driving homestead failures throughout western Kansas, and forcing established ranchers to sell cattle at devastating losses rather than watch their herds die of thirst. Creek beds that had run water for decades turned to cracked mud. Wells that had never failed went dry. The Flint Hills, usually green through the worst summer heat, turned brown and brittle as old leather. On ranches across the region, the crisis went beyond cattle and crops to strike at the foundation of daily survival: food preservation. Milk wasn't a luxury item that families could do without during hard times. It represented calories, nutrition, and morale when other food sources became scarce or expensive. More importantly, milk was the foundation of the dairy economy that kept many ranch families solvent between cattle sales. Fresh milk could be consumed immediately, but surplus milk converted into butter and cheese created trade goods that held value and could be stored for months. When milk spoiled before it could be processed, families lost food, labor time, and the economic opportunity to turn their daily production into lasting wealth. The traditional methods for keeping milk cool worked adequately during normal Kansas summers, but the sustained heat of the drought years pushed every preservation technique to its breaking point. Most ranch families relied on shaded areas, wet cloths wrapped around containers, and quick consumption to prevent spoilage. A few had dug root cellars that stayed cooler than surface buildings, and some had built simple milk houses that used evaporation and airflow to reduce temperatures. But these methods depended on moderate conditions and frequent attention, and they failed catastrophically when temperatures climbed above 100 degrees for weeks at a time. The physics of milk preservation were unforgiving. Bacteria that caused spoilage multiplied rapidly at temperatures above 60 degrees, turning fresh milk sour within hours during extreme heat. Even when families managed to keep milk from spoiling completely, the quality degraded quickly at elevated temperatures, affecting the taste and reducing the butterfat content that made dairy products valuable for trade. Butter simply melted into unusable liquid when stored above 70 degrees, and cheese-making became impossible when starting temperatures were too high. The difference between successful dairy preservation and total loss often came down to maintaining temperatures below 65 degrees, a nearly impossible standard during drought summers without mechanical cooling systems. Martha Keene, who ran dairy operations on a ranch 15 miles east of Jones, lost more than half her milk production during the worst weeks of 1894. Her family had built their milk house using standard frontier techniques, a small stone building positioned to catch morning breezes, with thick walls and a roof designed to reflect heat. Inside, she arranged milk containers on wooden shelves and covered them with wet cloths that she replaced several times daily. The system had worked reliably for 8 years, keeping milk fresh long enough to separate cream and churn butter that brought premium prices in Cottonwood Falls. But when temperatures stayed above 95 degrees for 3 consecutive weeks in July, 1894, with nighttime lows barely dropping below 75, even her careful attention couldn't prevent spoilage. Milk turned sour between morning and evening milking. Butter melted faster than she could work it into saleable blocks. The cream that should have been her family's primary cash income became a total loss, and she found herself in the position of having to buy dairy products from town rather than selling her surplus production. Other families faced similar disasters. The Caldwell Ranch, built on high ground with excellent drainage and all the conventional advantages that Jones had supposedly ignored, struggled with the same preservation problems that affected everyone else in the region. Hiram Caldwell had constructed a traditional root cellar that stayed 20 degrees cooler than outside air during normal summers, adequate for storing vegetables and grain, but insufficient for dairy preservation when outside temperatures exceeded 100 degrees. His cellar temperature climbed into the 80s, well above the threshold for safe milk storage, and his family watched weeks of dairy production spoil despite their best efforts to maintain cooling through traditional methods. The economic impact extended beyond individual family losses. The drought had already reduced cattle prices and grain production, making dairy income more critical for ranch survival than during normal years. Families that depended on butter and cheese sales to cover expenses found themselves unable to produce tradable dairy goods just when they needed the income most desperately. The combination of reduced production and increased spoilage meant that many ranching families faced cash flow crises that threatened their ability to maintain operations through the drought period. Surface water sources that had sustained cooling systems became unreliable or disappeared entirely. Creeks that normally provided water for wet cloth cooling dried to isolated pools, and those pools became too warm to provide effective cooling anyway. Wells that had supplied water for evaporative cooling systems either failed completely or produced water at temperatures too high to be useful for preservation. Families found themselves hauling water longer distances for basic household needs, leaving little extra for the cooling systems that their dairy preservation depended upon. The crisis revealed the limitations of preservation methods that worked adequately during moderate conditions but failed when stress-tested by extreme weather. Shade alone couldn't provide sufficient cooling when air temperatures climbed above body temperature. Evaporation techniques required constant water supplies that were no longer available. Root cellars and milk houses that had performed reliably for years suddenly became inadequate when the temperature differential between inside and outside air narrowed to the point where bacterial growth continued unchecked. Neighbors who had mocked Jones for building his elaborate spring room system began paying attention to different details. While their own dairy operations struggled with spoilage losses and preservation failures, stories circulated that Jones was somehow maintaining normal milk quality and butter production despite the same extreme temperatures that were defeating everyone else. The rumors seemed impossible given the conditions, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Jones continued bringing high-quality butter to market when other producers couldn't deliver usable products. His family continued consuming fresh milk when neighboring families were rationing dairy consumption to stretch their limited supplies. The vindication came not through arguments or demonstrations, but through results that neighbors could taste and measure. While ranch families throughout the Flint Hills watched their dairy production spoil in the relentless heat of 1894, Stephen Jones continued delivering fresh milk, firm butter, and properly aged cheese to Cottonwood Falls, as if the drought had never happened. The contrast became impossible to ignore when Jones's products commanded premium prices while other producers couldn't bring anything to market that met basic quality standards. Martha Keene was among the first to swallow her pride and ask direct questions. After losing another full day's milk production to spoilage, she rode to the Jones ranch and requested to see exactly how his preservation system worked. Jones led her down through the root cellar and along the stone-lined tunnel to the spring room, where the explanation became immediately obvious. The chamber felt like stepping into a different season, with air temperature holding steady in the upper 50s, even when surface temperatures climbed above 100 degrees. Cold spring water flowed continuously through the stone troughs, maintaining a temperature of 54 degrees that never varied regardless of the weather, above ground. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Milk containers sat partially submerged in the flowing spring water, surrounded by air that stayed cool through contact with the stone walls and constant water circulation. The thermal mass of the limestone construction absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, dampening the temperature swings that affected surface buildings. But the real key was the continuous water flow that prevented stagnation while providing consistent cooling that no surface method could match. Where traditional cooling techniques fought a losing battle against extreme heat, Jones's system simply ignored surface conditions and operated according to underground physics that remained constant year-round. Keene examined the construction details with the critical eye of someone who understood dairy preservation requirements. The stone troughs were precisely sized to accommodate standard milk containers while maintaining proper water depth for maximum cooling efficiency. The water flow rate was controlled by adjustable stone dams that allowed fine-tuning for seasonal variations in spring output. Wooden shelving positioned above the water level provided space for containers that needed cooling without direct water contact. The entire system was designed for practical daily use rather than theoretical perfection, with every detail reflecting actual experience in dairy handling. The temperature differential was dramatic and measurable. While her own milk house struggled to maintain temperatures in the 80s during the worst heat, Jones's spring room held steady at 56 degrees with minimal variation throughout the day. That 25-degree difference represented the gap between spoilage and preservation, between economic loss and continued productivity. Milk stored at 56 degrees remained fresh for days instead of hours. Cream separated cleanly for butter production, and cheese could be aged properly, without the bacterial contamination that ruined batches started at higher temperatures. Jones explained the system without boasting or lengthy technical discussions. Moving water stayed cooler and cleaner than stagnant pools, he noted, pointing to the continuous flow that prevented the bacterial buildup that plagued static cooling systems. Stone construction provided thermal mass that buffered temperature changes, while the underground location eliminated solar heating that overwhelmed surface buildings. The integration with household water systems meant the same spring water served multiple purposes, flowing from source to cooling system to irrigation without waste or additional infrastructure requirements. The practical advantages extended beyond temperature control. The spring room provided secure storage that protected valuable dairy products from theft, weather damage, and accidental contamination. The underground location offered storm shelter when violent weather threatened. Surface buildings. The constant cool temperature made the space comfortable for food preparation work during hot weather, creating a functional workspace when kitchen temperatures became unbearable. What had seemed like expensive over-engineering proved to be a multi-purpose facility that solved several frontier problems with a single construction project. Hiram Caldwell arrived 3 days later with specific questions about construction techniques and costs. He examined the stonework, measured the trough dimensions, and tested the water temperature at multiple points to understand how the flow pattern maintained cooling efficiency. The engineering impressed him despite his earlier skepticism about building in low ground. Jones had solved the drainage problems that worried conventional builders by embracing water flow rather than fighting it, turning potential flooding issues into controlled water management that served the household's preservation needs. The construction details were straightforward enough that any competent stonemason could replicate the basic system. The troughs required careful grading to maintain proper flow without creating dead spots where water could stagnate, but the techniques were well within frontier building capabilities. The tunnel construction demanded more excavation work than most families would attempt, but the core cooling principles could be applied to simpler springhouse designs that achieved similar results with less investment. What mattered most was access to reliable spring water and the willingness to build around water flow rather than trying to exclude it from the construction site. Word spread through informal networks that carried technical information across rural communities. Ranch wives who managed dairy operations shared details about trough construction and container placement techniques. Builders discussed stone selection and tunnel engineering over coffee and Cottonwood Falls. Young men seeking work learned construction skills by helping neighbors adapt Jones's cooling principles to their own spring sources and water systems. The knowledge became part of local building tradition rather than remaining proprietary information controlled by a single innovative rancher. Ezra Whitman began construction on his own spring room system during the fall of 1894, positioning it to take advantage of a smaller spring on his property that had been dismissed as inadequate for household water supply. While his installation lacked the integrated plumbing and elaborate tunnel system that connected Jones's spring room to the main house, the basic cooling chamber achieved the same temperature control that had made Jones's dairy operation drought-proof. The investment paid for itself within the first summer of operation by eliminating spoilage losses that had cost Whitcomb hundreds of dollars during the previous drought year. The technique spread quietly across the region as practical. Families copied what worked and ignored what didn't fit their specific situations. Not everyone had the capital to build Jones's elaborate integrated system, but most had access to spring water that could be developed for cooling purposes using simpler construction methods. The core principle proved adaptable to various scales and budgets, while delivering consistent results that made the difference between dairy success and failure during extreme weather conditions. The Jones Ranch became a destination for visitors who came not to admire the elaborate mansion, but to study the underground systems that had proven their worth during the worst conditions Kansas could deliver. Ranchers from as far as Nebraska and Oklahoma traveled to examine the spring room construction and adapt the principles to their own properties. The techniques that had once seemed like expensive eccentricity transformed into standard practice as practical families recognized the economic value of reliable cooling, systems that operated without fuel costs or mechanical maintenance. By 1900, variations of spring-fed cooling rooms appeared throughout the Flint Hills region, wherever reliable groundwater sources made construction feasible. Most installations were simpler than Jones's integrated system, but they incorporated the same basic principles that made his operation drought-proof. Stone-lined channels carried spring water through underground chambers, where milk containers sat in flowing water, maintained at steady temperatures between 54 and 58 degrees. The construction techniques became part of local building knowledge, passed along through the informal networks that carried practical information across rural communities. Martha Keene expanded her original cooling system by redirecting a small spring that emerged on the hillside above her milk house. Rather than building an entirely new underground facility, she modified her existing structure by adding a stone-lined channel that carried spring water through a shallow trough along one wall of the building. The flowing water lowered the interior temperature by 15 degrees compared to her previous passive cooling methods, enough to prevent spoilage during all but the most extreme heat waves. The modification cost less than $50 in materials and labor, but eliminated dairy losses that had previously cost her family several $100s annually. The engineering principles that Jones had demonstrated found applications beyond dairy preservation, as families discovered that reliable cooling systems solved multiple frontier problems. Root cellars supplied with flowing spring water maintained more consistent temperatures for long-term food storage, reducing spoilage of preserved vegetables, cured meats, and stored grains. Household water supplies stayed cooler and cleaner when routed through spring-fed systems, rather than stored in static cisterns that warmed during summer heat. Even ice harvested during winter lasted longer when stored in spring-cooled chambers, extending the season for mechanical refrigeration into summer months. The construction techniques evolved as local builders gained experience with water management and stonework. Early installations sometimes failed due to inadequate drainage or improper grading that created stagnant pools where bacteria could multiply. Successful builders learned to maintain continuous flow rates that prevented contamination while providing maximum cooling efficiency. They discovered that stone selection mattered, with dense limestone providing better thermal mass than softer materials that absorbed heat without releasing it effectively. The accumulated knowledge improved construction quality, while reducing costs as builders avoided mistakes that had plagued earlier installations. Hiram Caldwell completed his spring room project in 1901, incorporating lessons learned from observing other installations throughout the region. His system included features that Jones's original design had lacked, such as adjustable flow controls that allowed fine-tuning for seasonal variations in spring output, and removable wooden platforms that simplified cleaning and maintenance. The total construction cost remained under $200, but the facility eliminated dairy spoilage problems that had cost his family nearly that amount during single bad summers. The economic justification was clear enough that he recommended similar installations to neighbors who had adequate spring sources. The ranch house itself underwent modifications during the 1920s and 1930s as modern appliances became available in rural Kansas. Electric refrigeration arrived along with improved stoves, updated plumbing, and other conveniences that reduced the household's dependence on the original preservation systems. But the spring room continued operating alongside mechanical refrigeration because it provided cooling capacity that cost nothing to maintain and never failed due to equipment problems or power outages. Families that had invested in spring-fed cooling systems found them useful as backup preservation systems and additional storage space even after adopting electric refrigerators. The integration of old and new technologies demonstrated the lasting value of systems designed around natural processes rather than mechanical solutions alone. Modern refrigerators provided precise temperature control and convenient access, but they required electricity, periodic maintenance, and eventual replacement. Spring-fed cooling systems required only occasional cleaning and minor stone repairs while providing decades of reliable operation. The The combination offered redundancy that proved valuable during equipment failures or power disruptions that could threaten food stores during critical periods. Agricultural extension agents who studied rural preservation methods during the 1930s documented spring-fed cooling systems as examples of appropriate technology that remained cost-effective even after mechanical alternatives became available. The systems required minimal capital investment compared to electric refrigeration while providing cooling capacity that served multiple household functions. The construction techniques were within the capabilities of local builders, using materials available in most rural areas. The operational costs were essentially zero after initial construction, making the systems particularly valuable for families with limited cash income who needed reliable food preservation. The original Jones installation continued functioning into the mid-20th century, maintained by successive owners who recognized the value of the integrated water management system that Stephen Jones had designed during the 1870s. The spring room provided cold storage that supplemented modern appliances, while the flowing water system supplied household needs and irrigation for gardens and landscaping. The construction had proven durable enough to require only minor maintenance over 70 years of continuous operation. Modern visitors to the preserved ranch site can examine the original spring room and tunnel system that demonstrated how frontier builders could create reliable cooling systems using natural processes and local materials. The stone construction remains intact. The water flow continues at the same temperature and volume that sustained the Jones family through drought years, and the cooling effect still works exactly as designed more than a century after completion. National Park Service interpreters explain the system to visitors as an example of sustainable technology that solved practical problems without dependence on external energy sources or complex mechanical systems. The lesson that emerged from Jones's controversial construction project was ultimately simple. The smartest frontier builder wasn't the one who fought natural conditions, but the one who understood how to harness them for practical advantage. Water that seemed like an obstacle to conventional builders became the foundation of a preservation system that outperformed more expensive alternatives while operating reliably under the worst conditions Kansas weather could deliver.